on Rosenthal's Lane. Why was the exit poll not used as data? Because that's another. Well, one of my concerns is that people are notoriously bad at remembering how they voted. So that these two studies will be influenced by the fact that those people knew that the Tories had won, and more of them might have said they voted Tory because of that. The exit polls probably are real people closer to the election and more likely to have that degree of inaccuracy removed.
Yeah, I may hand over to someone else for the sort of technical details, but I mean, we've used it in a circumstantial way. I mean, in trying to evaluate claims about misreporting and so on. I think, I mean, we haven't mentioned it today, but certainly in the kind of, random probability versus quota, then there's perhaps something there, although it's not strictly random, the exit poll. But I think the main answer is that the design is rather different because of the selection of constituencies and so on. Anyone, do you have anything to add on? Anyone have anything to add on why we haven't used it directly?
Yes, I think that is it. The design of the exit poll, which is for the purpose that it is used for, and is very successful, I might add, is such that it's not even very good for estimating vote shares in the constituencies where it's done and used. But but even for that, it's complicated. So from that to go to any very useful additional information for our inquiry is quite difficult. So we did not find a way of really making use of it in any very direct way.
Yeah.
Steve,
Ben was going to say something on that. Yeah.
I just wanted to add in one point on that, which is that the exit poll.
You can stand up, Ben. Yeah.
The exit poll, as currently constructed, only asks how did you vote. It asks nothing about any other characteristics or anything like that. Exit polls in other countries, like the United States, do a sort of full battery of, male, female, age, etc. Historically, they've been less good at actually getting the election result correct. There are trade-offs with having that longer form in terms of people giving you the right answer and not walking away when you ask for how they voted. So it would be a different exit poll or an additional exit poll that would provide the kind of information that would be indeed very valuable for the 2035 inquiry.
There's a question here. Yeah. We don't have any microphones. We do, but I don't know where they are. They were knocking around.
Okay, not to worry.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make 2 points about herding. The first is
Rosie,
that it's not a phenomenon confined to the polls. It is, in fact, a very general phenomenon, I think. I've got a quote from Luis Alvarez, a well-known physicist who won a Nobel Prize. And he says, everyone who has examined the way the best values of fundamental physical constants have varied over time has noted there is usually a fashionable value that is often many standard deviations away from a later value more precisely known. So there it is. It happens with physical constants. It happens in economic forecasts as well. One always finds that they are generally closer together than the reality when it's known. Leading on from that, I've got 2 suggestions. One is that the Royal Statistical Society ought to investigate the phenomenon more generally and not confined to the polls. The second is that possibly the British Polling Council could set up a unit or a system whereby the pollsters could report anonymously their initial results before they've applied any final adjustments to the figures, and then with an incentive to do this as a code that they could supply along with it. And then, if they find they're right, they can reveal the code and claim credit, and if not, not. But in the meantime, one would have data that the British Polling Council could publish showing how much variability there really is between the polls before these final adjustments are made, and thus remove the false feeling of confidence in the polls that probably is why the results were so much more damaging this time than on previous occasions.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the certainly we're aware of the economic forecasting being another area where this has been pointed to. I think we've tried to move away from the idea that it's primarily about, you know, people cooking the books and doing this. We very much feel that, you know, and actually looking at the data, it's much more plausible that it happens as a sort of unconscious process for each pollster, and maybe not each pollster, but some pollsters trying to do their best to get, or, you know, let's think, we really think that our Labour numbers are too high, so keep putting this until, you know, so it's if it's happening, it's that sort of process. I mean, we there was discussion after the election of there being one poll that wasn't published, but it would seem implausible that happens in very great numbers, because I would have thought mostly pollsters only do polls that are paid for by a client. So, and Nick Moon, did you want to say something on a BPC hat on? Yeah. Can we? If we got anyone who can walk in, could you do the walking around?
Under BBC rules, members actually have voted data on their websites anyway. It might have been paperless, but you don't need BBC to set up an on reporting. It's already under transparency rules. They must put it on their websites within an hour of publishing the poll. Yeah.
Oh, you'd finished before we got the mic to you. That's great. Impressive.
Do we have an answer to that question then? Would the Salvation unpublished poll have made a difference to the hurting the conclusions?
I think it probably would, because there's a very small number of polls, as Ben said. You know, any one in or out would certainly change the numbers a bit. Yeah, it would certainly increase the variability. David, I think someone right. Sorry, Penny, right at the back now. Do say who you are.
So, David Cowling. You mentioned that there's no difference between, or very little difference between the modes, internet versus telephone. I logged 92 polls in the campaign, 20 of them telephone polls, 14 of which gave Conservative leads. Not massive ones, but that's 70%. Of the 72 remaining, the internet polls, 19 had Conservative leads, 26%. Of the 3 polls in the campaign that came anywhere close to the 6.57% Tory lead, 1 6-point Conservative lead, 2 5-point Conservative leads, were telephone polls. And yet we don't seem to think that there's any obvious difference between the modes. I'm interested.
Yeah, I don't know if I can. Ben can take this. Do you want to, you can stand up here, Ben. And
so I think I don't have the number for just the averages across the entire poll off the top of my head. Part of the reason why the few polls that sort of got up into the large Conservative leads were all telephone polls is the telephone polls are all much smaller samples. And so there is more variability in the telephone polls. And so they were more likely to pick up one of those results due to sampling variability. Now, I just don't have the numbers in front of me or off the top of my head on the averages. But I assume we wouldn't have put up that claim without having actually compared those means, since it is a very sensible thing to do. But I think it's just not very large, the average difference, even though there are some differences.
But it's a good point, and I think we've actually been focusing on the polls that we haven't. We've been particularly focusing on the final polls, but we may be missing something by not looking at all the polls across the entire campaign, which we have that data as well. So thanks, Will. We are open to keeping on looking at things. We're very much wanting to have people say, have you thought about this or looked at that, or I've got this amazing data set that you can have. Yes.
You keep focusing on one key number, which
Here comes the mic. There you go.
You keep focusing on one key number, which is the Conservative minus Labour lead, and it's the one which fascinates all of the news press going into the election campaign. But the most important number is the number of seats. So is there anything in there, because as Jon Snow and whoever else would always say, if this swing was replicated in every single seat across the country, this is what we'd expect to see. And we all know that swing is not replicated in every single seat across the country. So is there anything in here to say about how we should be doing things going forward to get a better understanding of the prediction of seats rather than the overall swing, which is still quite a crude proxy measure?
I mean, we really haven't. I mean, I'll let Steve Fisher come and say this.
I think the quick answer is if you had to pick a single figure from the polls and the share of the vote that was most important for determining the number of seats for the main parties and who's going to govern, it is that difference between the Conservative and Labour lead. And that's where the polling miss was most striking, and that's why we focused for this presentation on that. It's also the case in this election that once you know that and have estimated that lead right, you get to the Tories at 320, which is only 11 short of the figure that they actually got, and then it's a small jump from there. So the political story would have been right in terms of seat predictions if the polls had been right, except for the bit about getting a majority. And then the bit of extra work you need to do there is think about incumbency bonuses. First-term incumbents, particularly first-term Tory incumbents, did a little bit better, and that explains the extra 10 seats or so.
Yeah, it's worth saying that on the inquiry panel we do have the sort of the three teams who attempt to do the translation of shares into seats in a more sophisticated way than uniform swing. So there are other ways of doing it. As Steve said, if they've got the lead right, then the seats would have been right this time as well, approximately. Matt, can we get the mic through across to Matt?
Hi, Matt Singh, Number Crunch Politics. Just a couple of questions, one of which kind of follows on from David's point about the phone online differences. I think where that circle squares is that there were probably bigger mode effects earlier on in the campaign and before the campaign than in the final. I mean, the final poll on the gap, it was only a quarter of a point difference, I think, between phone and online. So, I mean, I don't know if there was any way to look at the herding analysis in the context of that. The other thing in terms of phone online difference, I know most of what you've been looking at is in terms of the Labour-Tory gap, but in terms of the final polls, the only real difference between the two modes I noticed was on the UKIP share, and that I guess was borderline significant, and it was offset by the Labour and Tory combined shares the other way. I mean, is there anything you can say on that? Is there any evidence of shy UKIP maybe on the phone, or? Well, if you did, how would you know?
A contradiction in terms, perhaps. I don't think we have. You're right in the sense that we've spent so much time thinking about the lead that the other parties, I think we haven't looked at in as much detail as we might, because that's kind of not so much the story of why the polls were right. If they'd have got if that had been significant, it wouldn't have made much difference to the story. But I think there perhaps is something that we take away from on mode, which is that we perhaps need to. I mean, we're aware. We had a discussion actually before this meeting, going over things where we realised that there are other things that we can look at within modes as well, which is kind of some of the age distribution things. We're not quite sure whether the 60 plus or the 80 plus thing is quite so severe in phone. So there are more detailed things to look at in mode. And actually, they're a very clever bunch. That's why I picked them to be on the team. But they said if you say mode doesn't make a difference, they'll pick up on that and say. So really, what I was saying, mode didn't make a difference to the final poll miss. That was what I was saying there. But not that mode doesn't matter at all. I think you were next, and then 2, 3, 4. If you can remember your number, that'll help me. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Sumit Raman from the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills. In your sort of analysis of sort of individual, sort of voter turnout or probability of actually turning out to vote, are you going to look at something like where you live and sort of the impact that the constituency you're part of might have an impact on your tendency to vote? I'm thinking if you're a Labour voter in a very, very strong Conservative seat from the previous election, that might reduce your chances of actually bothering to go out to vote if the weather's bad, or vice versa. Was that something that anyone else has looked at in the past?
I think it's an interesting but probably slightly separate question. I don't know, Jouni, if you've got anything to add to... I mean, the key point is, you know, to get the probability of turning out right. I mean, and so whether that... I mean, it's clearly the case that different people have different turnout probabilities, and that may be affected by the kind of area they live in. There may be some interaction. Whether that is something that can be included in a turnout model is unlikely, I would say. Do you have anything to say on that, Jouni? No.
Much really. I mean, one thing that it's no doubt a very interesting sort of political science question, but for this exercise, one key issue would be where does the evidence come from? You know, remember if such a model was employed as part of polling methodology, the evidence for how exactly does turnout, given also age and self-reported voting intention, how does it in addition depend on, say, what kind of constituency you're in? That evidence would have to come from British election study 5 years ago. And then there's the question of whether the mechanism, the relationship between those two that held 5 years ago would still hold now sufficiently well to help you in this exercise. And my own sort of first guess would be probably not. So I think for the turnout model, they won't benefit from being elaborated beyond a certain point.
I think there's a certain sort of class of question that we get asked often, which, as Jouni said, that's an interesting political science question. It certainly is, but the question for us is always, we're interested in those kinds of questions for the most part, but you know, did they affect the polling miss? And I think that one would probably be that's an interesting political science question that didn't affect the polling miss. Okay, we had, who was two? Two, yes.
Robert Hayward. Quick observation about the presentation, and I'll obviously look at the presentation in greater detail. I'm assuming we're all going to be sent it.
Yeah, I meant to say that this is available on the Polling Inquiry website, so
Thank
you
you.
can...
My observation is that I'm not convinced, having listened to the presentation, that next time's polls are going to be more accurate, markedly more accurate than this time. And that does concern me as somebody who actually spends rather a lot of time looking at them. Can I make one other observation, and that is that throughout the period from 2010 to 2015, we were looking at a group of people who were ex-Lib Dems who were voting overwhelmingly for the Labour Party. And I understand why you looked at Conservative Labour, but I think it was a BES study that actually said they didn't split like this. And it is certainly worth remembering that the Tory party gained 8 seats off the Labour Party at the general election. They took 27 off the Lib Dems. And therefore, while I understand the concentration on Conservative versus Labour, actually the thing that really impacted on the final result was a different movement.
Yeah, I mean, on the first one, I think I'd slightly qualify the conclusion. I do think that the likelihood of a miss, if the election were, you know, repeated in a hypothetical sense, I think the polling industry will take things, you know, on board and try and make useful changes. I think, you know, but that, having said that, as my final point, you know, there is always, history shows us, you know, there's ultimately, if we stay within the same paradigm, we can collect people from the, you know, internet, from the telephone, and stand on the street corner with a clipboard, as people used to do in the past. But ultimately, the statistical methodology is the same. You're using quotas and so on, and so the assumptions that Jouni Kuha ran through are always the same for all of those. That's a fragile methodology. Things can go wrong, but there ain't many reasonable alternatives. So it is a case of realising that they're the you know, the worst kind of, you know, whatever paraphrase Churchill. They're a terrible way of of assessing who's going to win the election, but they're a hell of a lot better than all the alternatives. So we need to bear that in mind. I mean, I think on the kind of the sort of political dynamics, I could put that in the category of that's an interesting political science question, but I do think there is potential. I might look to one of my colleagues here, maybe Jane, can say something about. I mean, the idea that somehow the bias was about not picking up the people who moved from Lib Dem to Labour, that there were a lot of them going to the Conservatives. That
I think what you're referring to work by my colleagues John Brennan and Chris Thorne, and the work that they were doing was the work that was done on the internet panel, which shows that there were many people who said they were going to vote Liberal Democrats in 2010. Those people were less likely to actually turn out to vote. Those people then switched to Labour. Those people then looked less likely to turn out to vote. So that was an explanation that was really saying this is a differential turnout problem. That piece of analysis was then updated when we had the vote validation evidence from the British election study, and I know John Brennan and Chris Cross will be soon releasing some updated analysis looking at how that bears on some, that bears on my own sampling, but they don't now think the story was differential turnout. So in a sense, you're right to flag the importance of the transmission of the Lib Dems to the Tories, perhaps saying they were going to vote Labour, not eventually doing so. Lots of interesting vote seats. I think that very much falls into the category of interesting political science. But certainly that's not being ignored. But we don't think now that differential turnout story is part of the explanation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Matt Singh has done some work showing the same thing, and I mean that's an interesting, the political dynamics between 2010 2015. But in principle, whatever the underlying political dynamics, if stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3 are all done properly, without violating assumptions, then whatever the underlying political dynamics, you'll get the vote intention right. And who was number 3 there? Yes, please. Sorry to refer to you in numbers.
Mike Smithson from Political Betting. Looking forward, we've got within 5-6 months the European referendum, where we've got a massive modal divide in terms of the output from the polls. We have, I think, Ipsos Mori phone poll and Converge showing leads for Remain of 21% and 19%, and you're moving right over to some of the online polls, the admittedly newer firms, which are now showing leads for Leave of 7-8%. And I think, I just wonder, I worry that we might be having this sort of event post the referendum to look what went wrong with the polling there.
Yeah, I mean, at least one benefit seems to be that they won't be all saying the same thing. The EU referendum. But yeah, I mean, the referendum is a difficult one because actually this is, you could describe the quota approach as being a kind of a modelling exercise rather than a sampling exercise, and perhaps we've got a better model for elections, for general elections, than we have for referenda, because we've got past vote and we kind of think we know about how various other things work, and turnout we probably know a bit better, and so on. So yeah, it's tricky, but perhaps the mode thing maybe gives at least some advantage initially in terms of trying to hone in on why online is telling you something rather different from telephone. It's interesting, given the way that the polling inquiry has relied, and others, John Curtis and the BES have relied on British Social Attitude Survey, British Election Study, random. If you look at the British Election Study, asked a question about the referendum, who would you stay or leave, at about the same time as the polls, and that comes down much more on the side of where the phone polls are at the moment. So take that as you wish, but it's that sort of, I think, that sort of careful looking at things, and also the potential, as I was mentioning earlier, for where random comes into the mix of things, that possibly there is a role for it to serve as some sort of calibration. That you figure out why the polls are differing by having that sort of gold standard that you can calibrate to. Do any of my colleagues want to add anything on that? Okay, I think we had number 4 was there, and then Patrick and
Tom Smithard. It's very interesting to see that late swing didn't really seem to be a major factor in this, and I wondered whether, I mean, I work for the Lib Dems, and we saw something very different in the marginal constituencies over the last couple of weeks from canvassing returns, and I suspect, having spoken to my Conservative colleagues in particular, they saw exactly the same thing in the marginal seats. Now, obviously, you didn't get much data from the marginal seats to look at. I was gratified to hear last time around that Joe was saying that YouGov are going to start doing a lot more constituency-level polling. I wonder if that's a recommendation you might be prepared to make to encourage other pollsters to do that, because as we're hearing from gentlemen from Biz and from Rob, people do have very different opinions in marginal constituencies. Secondly, the one thing that a lot of the polls did show pretty uniformly throughout was the number of undecided people right up to the last few days. And it's very interesting to see ICM coming out of a poll this week where they've got pass vote weighting different for the various different parties. I wonder whether you looked into pass vote weighting and whether there should be different weightings per party. And if so, maybe it should be even more dynamic, so different pass vote weightings depending on different demographic groups as well. Have you looked into that at all, and is that something you would be looking at over the next few months, if not?
So could you just say what you mean by different party weights? I wasn't quite sure what you meant.
Well, I'm sure ICM could add to this, but yeah, the reallocation of people who are undecided at present. Well, I can't remember the exact figures they're using, but they're different now for Lib Dems and Tory and Labour Party. Is that something that you have spotted in the kind of big wad of data, that people are more likely to vote for the previous party if they're a Conservative voter or previously a Labour voter? Or?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly, I think looking at pass vote weighting and the longer in the tooth at the back here may correct me on this, but I think that was something that came out of the 92 sort of post-mortem, that this was something that, in our position, what the hell can you weight to that isn't already been done? So the last election result, we know what that is, so we can wait, so we can ask people who they voted for. But actually, what I think what's quite interesting is when we've looked across the different pollsters, you kind of think that, if they're rating to the age distribution of the population, they get it from the census, they should all be using the same age distribution. Past vote weighting, in principle, they'd all be weighting to the same population totals. But of course, the further you get away from an election, the slipperier that gets. There's people who are coming into the electorate who weren't eligible to vote, people dying, and all sorts of things. And actually, I think what pollsters think they're doing when they're weighting in that way is not really voting to the weight distribution, the vote distribution in the previous election. It's trying to sort of balance the proportions in the sample of party ID or something like that. But it's all quite imprecise, and they all do really rather different things. And that variation, as you saw in one of the slides, you'd think naively that them all doing very different things would sort of pull them all apart. No, it all pulls them all close together. That past vote weighting. So, and I think that's where you perhaps get into some problems. I mean, one of the sort of things that we're thinking about is maybe weighting to some population total for political engagement. Where's that going to come from? I mean, a big survey that asks people how interested they are in politics on a 1 to 4 scale. What if that's got a changing response rate or it's moving online? These are not hard, robust figures to weight to, and it leaves open that possibility that there'll be this kind of slippage and softness. But anyone, I'm looking to
The question was about where John Jones went and whether they
do you want to?
Well, you did that analysis.
Oh, where did the don't knows go? Well, I mean, in terms of the late swing, I mean, the best evidence we've got is what we put up here earlier, and it's a bit of a mixed bag, and we had long but very amicable debates about whether we should be weighting the average by the sample size, because YouGov have got a very, very big sample size in their recontact poll, but they don't find any change. If you weight by the size of the sample, which in principle is the right thing to do, that dominates everything. The one that you saw a real shift is a TNS, I think. TNS, I said I wasn't going to identify them. I think TNS kind of do see a shift if you use an attrition weight, but that's a sample of about 300 people. So, I mean, it is quite hard to know what to make of it. If you sort of look on, again, on averaging, there is a small movement from the don't knows towards the Conservatives. If you sort of aggregate all the polls together, but certainly even with generous assumptions, wouldn't add up to a percentage point in the swing. Jane, okay, Patrick.
Yeah, Patrick Brennan. I was actually going to ask about political voting again more generally, which I accept you've already sort of covered in your answer to Tom's question partially. But the point specifically I was interested in discussing was what the panel's view is on why political weighting, be it past vote weighting or a form of party ID weighting, was unable to correct for the kinds of sample imbalances that you seem to have identified in your report. I mean, if, for example, to take the example given in the presentation, that the issue with imbalances was due to not having enough very older people in the 65 plus age group, and that correlates strongly with voting Conservative. If that had held true in 2010 as well, we would have expected to have corrected largely for that mistake through some form of political or past vote weighting. So is the panel's view that the problem and the reason why that didn't work is more due to issues with false recall and voter turnover, such as you've mentioned, or does the panel think it's more to do with issues specific to this election, such as, for example, the fact that the Lib Dem vote collapsed so much, and that knowing how many people voted Lib Dem in 2010 won't tell you whether they're the type of Lib Dem voters that have gone to the Conservatives or the type that have gone to Labour? So is it more general problems with political weighting, or is it problems that just occurred in this particular election because of the large voter shifts that we saw with the Lib Dems and UKIP?
Anyone? Yeah, Jouni, please. Yeah. I think you've looked at this most closely.
No, this is answering only perhaps part of the question. I don't remember the time I made.
Do you want to stand by the mic? So
right, maybe 3 points, only partly related to the question. First of all, I want to re-emphasize the point that Patrick just made now, because we did find it fairly striking, that how the party ID past vote weighting, which is there for all but one of the companies, is implemented, really is quite remarkably variable. So there's in effect a set different way of doing it by every company. So they're certainly not all, for example, weighted to the results in 2010 election or something like that. So that's the first point. Second was that, just a sort of side point, that I think many of the configurational things about this particular election might well not hold 5 years from now. So very kind of micro calibrating any things based on this going forward might well be a bad idea for the usual sort of reason of overfitting, fighting the last war, basically. But the main question, I think, the party ID voting versus, for example, political engagement. If we think that part of the story was that the samples were too politically interested, too politically engaged, that is perhaps correlated. Well, it is correlated, but not very strongly correlated with things like sort of just blunt party leaning. Let's take the simple example, even though that's not what the companies mostly did. Let's suppose the party ID weighting was vote last time. That's of course quite a long way from identifying and sort of calibrating the more from the less interested, because within each vote, each party in voting, there are some more interested and some less interested. So it's just not the same thing, and unlikely to, well, looks like certainly didn't manage to do the job in that way, which it isn't meant to do. The party ID weighting, which came from the inquiry last time, that was sort of, if one of our slides was one way, one logical way, or a possible way to improve within this paradigm is to add more and more powerful weighting variables, which has many, many difficulties of its own. But last time that wasn't there, it was added. Now it's there. But it certainly didn't do the full job, so to speak.
Thanks. Penny Young, House of Commons librarian. You showed a really interesting historical chart on the error of the Conservative vote share, and I thought you were a little bit dismissive because you sort of said, oh, we've never really got it right anyway, so if it had been just not quite as bad as that, perhaps nobody would have noticed. But historically, it's actually the mid-80s since there was an overestimate on the Conservative vote share. Every time since then, the general election polls have underestimated it according to your chart. And I just wondered what you conclude from that. Was there some sort of collective amnesia on the part of the industry that this was a real risk to be constantly worried about, to be constantly sort of avoided? Why wasn't everybody talking about that and kind of collaborating and sharing to sort of avoid that peril which was happening pretty much at every general election for the last 25 years?
I think I might look to Will Jennings to say something. I'll just say something briefly and then Will can say something more informed, which is that, I think anecdotally, talking to pollsters, some of them would have liked to have cranked something to make the Conservative vote share go up a few points, but there has to be a principled reason for doing something. You can't. It wouldn't be right to say, okay, we're going to implement a new procedure where we get our final poll numbers and then we just add 3 to the Conservatives, even though that might actually do you some good. So I think we've got to say there are limits on what you can do in a principled way. I'll hand over to Will Jennings to.
I think it's a perfectly valid question that I can't give you the full answer to. And I think what's interesting, actually, you look at the historical graph and you see 1992 as being a particularly bad outlier in terms of underestimation of the Conservative vote share. And the fact that we were then presented out with past vote weighting as the solution out of the subsequent inquiry. One, because actually, if you look at that graph, then the error returns back to the historical trend and increasingly drops down. But obviously, there was a sense that something had been the problem had been fixed by past vote weighting that clearly hadn't been, that was given as the kind of silver bullet that perhaps shouldn't have been seen as such. Another thing that's worth saying in comparative context, which we did present here, but we have looked at comparative polling data from across the world based on various research I've done with Chris Religion. And again, there's this idea coming out that maybe kind of vote shares of left parties are overestimated, vote shares of kind of centre-right parties are underestimated. There is small evidence of that, but nothing on the scale to which would explain the blindness here. So again, although one could, I think the challenge of the historical data is that you would say this is a historical problem that seems to be getting worse, and maybe it's something to do with changing changes in society across advanced democracies, but we can't use that aggregate data to make very large inferential steps, and it should be seen as a kind of contextual information, both from the UK and from elsewhere, that we should think about while talking about these methodological problems, but we can't then use that as the basis for saying, well, there's an easy fix.
Yeah, today is not about the kind of the modelling that goes on of predicting them, which all these some of these guys do, but those models are building in that kind of expectation, or some of them are anyway, and so whether that, it seems to me that would be the appropriate place for trying to build in that kind of historical expectation into the sort of poll aggregation and forecasting than it would into the kind of the micro data polling. Right? There's a person here in the middle. Yeah. We're getting towards the last question time.
Hey, sorry, I'm Kevin Cunningham. I worked for the Labour Party for 4 years, sort of doing their internal modelling and polling and trying to predict elections, basically. So what I found was quite interesting here was the rationale for approaches for modelling turnout were not all very obvious, and that the poll estimates were also at the same time vulnerable to areas in turnout weighting. Now, what we did is we ended up using a lot of polling data to estimate the extent to which different people would be likely to vote for different parties, and we had a lot of we used the census data and basically were able to predict the likelihood of every individual voting for each party. And that gave us a certain result that was very similar to the results that all the polling firms were getting. But separately, we used the marked register to build a model to predict turnout. Now, unfortunately, what it appeared to be the case is that actual separate model, once we combined that with the support model, brought down to effectively what happened. So, based on a lot of our data, it just appeared to be the case that essentially the turnout was the biggest issue here. So I find it quite remarkable that, to some extent, that the turnout issue is sort of glossed over here, and that it doesn't appear to be that case. And to some extent, it's sort of explained, for me anyway, 2010, when the same demographic groups that had moved from the Lib Dems to Labour, the Lib Dems were overestimated in 2010, Labour were overestimated in 2005, and 2001, 97, and Labour again overestimated in 2015. It's sort of the same demographic group that doesn't necessarily turn out, and indeed doesn't necessarily turn out in European elections, in which there was also similar sort of overestimates.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that we glossed over it, and we certainly won't do in the report. It is, there are a lot of just so stories around, polling misses, that this happened and then that happened and that's what caused it. Turnout is one of them. The idea that particularly seemed plausible to me, that there were, that we overshot on the Lib Dems in 2010, and we know that a lot of people migrated from the Lib Dems to supposedly Labour, and then they didn't turn out, and so we explained both misses in one night. It just doesn't seem to have been the case. This isn't one where I would say I've said the late swing evidence is weaker than we would like and a bit inconsistent, but I think the turnout evidence is quite robust. We've got a number of different kinds of evidence, and they all show the same thing, which is in some ways quite surprising. But it is important to say, I mean, this is kind of the dog that didn't bark. The fact that it didn't cause the miss this time does not mean that everything's fine in that area, and certainly it could be the thing that causes a problem next time. And I think there are our initial feelings are that there are improvements that could be made in that area at fairly low cost. Jane Green.
To reassure you that one of the things, of course, we have looked at is not registers in this election ourselves, and perhaps at some point we could talk about what you did and what we've done. Certainly with the British Election Centre, we've done very extensive validation exercises on registration and on also turnout, and what we find is that we get a very tiny adjustment, so we get the lead a little bit closer to what it was, and we adjust for vote validation, but we nevertheless get too many Tories and too many Labour, and that's with a very, very extensive vote validation exercise that took us a very long time, and we're still about to release the vote validation data. So it would be good to talk to you about what we did, but just to say that is part of the process of what we've done for this year.
Yeah.
Just a brief comment, I think, on turnout, just more in the teaching mode, I guess. If you think of the kind of two extreme combinations of the sample and the turnout, the combination where the entire explanation is the turnout means that you start with the right kind of sample. You've got the right mixture of right kind of people in your sample, and then think of the turnout probability as sort of removing those who aren't voters. I mean, the perfect screen, meaning, once you ask them, did you vote? Those who say I didn't, you throw them out. So it's a 0-1 type of screen of people out. These turnout probably sort of are probabilistic fractional ones. Everybody gets sort of a fractional weight, and those are, we think are guaranteed to vote, they get that one weight, and those who we think are guaranteed not to vote get a 0, and everybody's in between. So if it was the turnout weights, then it would be that you remove the wrong people, so to speak. If it's the other way around, you start with the wrong people and then you remove the right ones of them, still leaving you with the wrong set of voters. Now, we certainly have no evidence at all with various kinds of it's the screening that did it, and it's partly because that we've tried so many different combinations which push it to various extremes of who gets dropped from nobody gets dropped to only the ones who guarantee say guaranteed to vote and so on. And nothing makes much of a difference. And part of it has to do with the fact that it's an observable fact, and Steve can comment on this. I think that the first order story of the turnout from the recontact polls to validate voting in these is that they were just very, very likely to vote. I mean, you saw that turnout type slide. The samples to begin with had a very large number of people who eventually ended up voting. So assigning very nearly all of them a very high probability of voting was really quite close to the truth, and that's indeed what the companies to a very large extent did. Because equally these people, when asked, are you going to vote? They said, yes, I'm very likely to vote, and that turned out to be a good prediction of that they did indeed vote. So it all just really didn't leave much room for that step as probabilistic screen of who votes to have much of an impact. Steve, did you want to?
Yes, thanks. It's fair to say that we've spent a lot of time talking about that probabilistic screening. So,
Just ask that last remark to be clarified. Are you saying that all the studies overestimated the actual voting behaviour of people, and that they would have all got the turnout wrong if that had been a factor that you were trying to forecast?
yes.
Yes, if these polls had been used to estimate.
They were all biased in that sense.
Yes, if the polls were collected in order to predict turnout, what percentage of voters will vote in this election, they would have been very bad.
Apart from one, I think.
There was some. Again, there are.
There's almost always one exception whenever you make it.
Shouldn't that be looked into?
It has been. Yeah, I mean,
it shows a bigger defect in sampling than just the Conservative Labour vote.
Well, yeah, I mean, if they were intended to estimate the turnout, then, but they're not. So, I mean,
but it's certainly the case that, given the way the methodological chain is supposed to work, as was described earlier, you should get the right answer for the turnout. And if you don't, that does imply there's a problem somewhere. So it's absolutely a useful indicator for whether this chain of assumptions that you're making and on which you're basing your analysis, whether those are being met. It's a very useful indicator for that.
Yeah. Okay, we have actually run over our allotted time. So thanks once again to all of you for coming. A reminder that we haven't covered everything that we've done, and we're going to be doing more. The report with recommendations will be published in March. The slides that we've used today are available on the NCRM polling website. And Jouni?
And if you could all wait an hour, say, until the final versions of the slides appear.
Yeah, we made some some small edits to what you've seen, which are different from the ones that are online. So we'll update to the final version. So, and I'd just like to finish once again by thanking my colleagues on the panel. Thanks very much.